Welcome to Doppelnamers, where we connect the dots between people who share the same name. My name is Elizabeth Russell, and this is the story of my doppelnamer, a pioneer named Elizabeth Russell, who was tried for murder in Eau Claire, Wisconsin in 1892. At the time, it was the most famous murder trial in Wisconsin's history. With me are my good friends Mary Jean Stead and Kathy Boyle Almeida. Neither MJ nor Kath knows anything about the story. They will be meeting the characters and hearing the facts right along with the listeners. I really appreciate you being here, and I'm sure the listeners do too, because whatever thoughts and questions you have, the listeners probably have as well. Before we get going, do you have any questions from our previous episodes?
I was wondering, can you remind me about Bertha, that we think possibly was with child?
We got that idea. We don't know for sure. We know she was ill. She was not feeling well at all.
Right.
And two different doctors examined her. I believe one of them said she had kidney problems, and one of them thought that she had become pregnant, but we don't know for sure.
And can you remind me, was she buried alive?
Oh, well, that too was from our last episode, and let's hold on to that one because we're going to talk about it.
That's a big mystery. All right.
That is such a good question, Kath, though, because we always want to know if someone was or was not buried alive. Today is episode 6, Inquest of the Dead. We'll get to the story in just a moment, but first, as always, we share somebody else's doppelnamer story. And today we meet Ted Kennedy. Ted Kennedy was a professional ice hockey center who played his entire career with the Toronto Maple Leafs from 1943 to 1957. Along with Turk Broda, he was the first player in NHL history to win 5 Stanley Cups and was inducted into the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1966. Ted Kennedy has been called the quintessential Maple Leaf, and by some, the greatest player in that team's history.
Go Ted.
Ted's father, Gordon Kennedy, was killed in a hunting accident 11 days before Ted was born. That left Ted's mother, Margaret, to raise a family of 4 children. To supplement her income, Margaret took a job selling treats at a local hockey arena, and so that arena became young Ted's second home. When Ted was 7 years old, a family friend took him to Toronto to see the first 2 games of the 1932 Stanley Cup Finals, and from watching those games, Maple Leaf players became Ted's childhood heroes. In his hometown of Port Colborne, Ontario, Ted was childhood friends with Elmer Eisler. Do you think it's funny that a hockey player's best friend was named Eisler?
I do.
I was just a little bit taken with Elmer as well.
Well, Elmer found fame as a choir conductor.
Okay, good.
And Ted's other best friend was Don Gallinger, who became infamous when in 1948 he was banned for life by the NHL for gambling while playing with the Boston Bruins. Ted Kennedy and his doppelnamer, United States Senator Edward Ted Kennedy, died within days of each other in August 2009.
Interesting.
Oh, weird.
It is weird. And I wonder if they ever met or even ever knew each other. They were both fairly prominent and well known.
Yeah.
So there's a reason I picked Ted Kennedy, and we'll learn that later. But for now, let's get on with the story.
All right.
In our last episode, we saw our characters gathered at Elizabeth Russell's farm as newlyweds Peter and Bertha Erickson prepared to move out. Bertha was ill, so while her husband and his siblings went into town for groceries, Bertha stayed behind with Elizabeth's father, Lathrop Horton, and Peter's brother, Adam Erickson. The plan was for Peter and the others to go get the groceries, then swing back to get Bertha, and then Peter and Bertha would head out to their new home in Drummond, Wisconsin. But shortly after the group left on the grocery run, Bertha took a turn for the worse. Elizabeth ran outside and nabbed the first person she could find, telling him to run into town and tell Peter to call a doctor and hurry back. Peter made it back in time to see Bertha alive, but the doctor he'd called did not. Bertha Jensen Erickson died at Elizabeth Russell's farm on April 1st, 1891. We also learned last time that there was no immediate talk of foul play following Bertha's death. The event was tragic, but the funeral and burial all happened in a pretty normal manner, and the characters went on with their lives. The first curious thing to happen involved Peter's brother Ed, who on election day, April 7th, 1891, went to the cemetery with a couple of friends and dug up Bertha's grave to see if she had been buried alive.
Let's just check.
Nothing better to do on election day.
Exactly.
It's so weird. Why did they think she might be buried alive?
No idea. And Ed had plenty of opportunity to express this concern prior to Bertha's burial, but he never did.
What was the time frame between when she passed away on April 1st and revisiting the grave?
6 days.
6 days of holding your breath.
To your question, Kath, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that Bertha had actually been buried alive. But after Ed's stunt, rumors began to fly, and Bertha's otherwise unremarkable death became a hot topic in the community. Now that led to William Frawley, the district attorney, not Fred Mertz.
Yeah, right.
Hearing about Bertha for the first time. He, William Frawley, was having supper with a local doctor whose name was Dr. Lyman, when a young woman who worked for both Dr. Lyman and also worked for Elizabeth Russell told Frawley and Lyman about Bertha's death. I'm thinking, okay, but still, what is it that would have interested William Frawley?
Yeah, it sounds like gossip.
So there isn't testimony on this point, but I have to believe that somehow Frawley got wind of the rumors surrounding Elizabeth and Peter's, quote, improprieties. Now, if you're just joining us, Peter had been Elizabeth's employee, and she had pressured him into a sexual relationship while her husband, Thomas Russell, was off working in the woods for the Valley Lumber Company. Now, William Frawley was 29 years old and the district attorney already.
Yeah.
I was picturing an older guy as district attorney.
He had graduated from the University of Wisconsin Law School just 3 years earlier in 1888. So we have to assume that he was trying to make a name for himself.
He's ambitious. He's trying to, yeah.
And what could be better than convicting a cougar of murdering the competition?
Scandal. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, here's how it played out. The newspapers just say that several weeks after Bertha's burial, Peter requested an autopsy. And that may be, but what suddenly led Peter to suspect foul play? The only link that makes sense to me is Frawley. And maybe also Bertha's father, John Jensen. I think Frawley might have gone to John Jensen, and then Jensen convinced Peter to request an autopsy.
Okay, now I don't know that much about how autopsies are usually undertaken. Haha.
Well, good one.
But isn't it? She's already been in the ground, right? And I mean, back then, I don't know what kind of embalming procedures they did.
Right? Autopsies typically take place prior
been
to burial.
She's already been dug up once. She's going to be dug up again.
I assume they buried her after they dug her up. They
They
didn't just
did.
leave her out, did
They
they?
did. You mean after Ed dug her up? Yes, they reburied her.
It was a fresh grave, easy to dig up.
So now we've got, probably at Frawley and Bertha's father's insistence, Peter is now demanding an autopsy. All right.
Okay.
Again, Peter and John Jensen seem to have some kind of a relationship, because remember, Mr. Jensen was one of only 3 or 4 people at Bertha and Peter's wedding. Almost
Yeah, it was
nobody
hushed
was
up.
there. Yeah.
That's right.
Now that
Wasn't
could,
it in like January or something?
yes, it was freezing cold in February, and they were outside
right.
standing on the county line.
Oh, yeah. That was odd too.
Good venue.
Right, so Peter and Mr. Jensen have some kind of a relationship, and it could be that they had a good relationship, or it could be because Mr. Jensen knew that Bertha had become pregnant and he'd forced a shotgun wedding. We don't know.
Hey.
Either
Mhm.
way, Peter and John Jensen were not strangers. Next, Peter apparently then went to see Dr. Chase, and Peter asked Dr. Chase to conduct the autopsy. Well, that did not go well. Here's what Dr. Chase had to say.
Oh, no.
I asked for what cause, and he, Peter, said he thought that she had been poisoned.
Oh.
I asked him who he mistrusted, and he said Mrs. Russell. I asked him, what reason have you to mistrust Mrs. Russell? Well, he said he didn't know. And I said making such a charge would put him in a bad light, and asked him what reason she would have for doing an act like that. He could give no further reason.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, Peter's like, yeah, I think she poisoned her. Why? I don't know. Because Frawley and John Jensen told me to say that.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Chase continued, there was quite a few people in my office. The conversation was prolonged, and I was wearied by his persistence. I said Mrs. Russell had struck me as a pleasant farmer lady, and I would not, under those circumstances, go and hold a postmortem unless he had more proof. So, with Dr. Chase not having it, who do you think they got?
The other doctor, what's his name?
Who they got was Frawley's dinner buddy, Dr. Lyman.
Oh, right.
Okay.
Right.
He's the third doctor. Okay.
Correct. And remember that Frawley first heard about this whole thing when he was having dinner with his friend, Dr. Lyman.
That's right.
So they got Dr. Lyman to agree to do this autopsy. And Dr. Lyman did not work for free. In evidence, we have a receipt from Frawley handwritten on a tiny scrap of paper. And I have held that in my hand at the archives.
Oh, cool.
It reads, received from Peter Erickson, $75 on account of Dr. Lyman, W.H. Frawley. Now, let's pause because there are several things about this receipt. First, this was a tiny little scrap. And in fairness, I think back then they wrote a lot on tiny little scraps.
Oh, true.
So first thing, the state was obviously not paying for this autopsy. Now, maybe that's how it worked back then, or maybe this whole thing was going down under the table. I don't know, but this was definitely a private pay situation. Second, the money was flowing through Frawley. Third, as we already know, Peter had no money. So where had it come from? The receipt said received from Peter Erickson.
Right.
The money came from Bertha's father, John Jensen.
Jensen.
And get this, John Jensen testified eventually at the trial that he'd actually paid $100, not $75.
Oh.
75 of the dollars was for Dr. Lyman, and the other $25 went into Frawley's pocket for delivering it to Dr. Lyman.
Oh, wow.
That's suspicious.
Yeah, that is.
The controlling statute at the time said that physicians and surgeons subpoenaed to make examination of a body shall receive fees, the reasonable amount of which shall be determined by the district attorney, but shall not be less than $5 for each examination.
Yeah, it seems like you paid a lot.
So basically, the going rate for a doctor performing an autopsy was around $5. So Frawley, the district attorney, used his blank slate discretion to determine that his buddy, Dr. Lyman, should get $75 instead of $5, with a convenience fee of $25 for himself.
Check.
Do you remember the title of our second episode? The Corrupt 90s?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
There you go.
The next milestone in this case was the actual autopsy, which Wisconsin statutes at the time called an inquest of the dead. I'll describe the pretty grisly autopsy in a moment, but first, are you up for a bit of law talk?
Oh, sure. Bring it on.
Because it kind of matters to the story. So let's start with the U.S. Constitution. The Fifth Amendment starts off with this: no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. A grand jury decides whether a person should be formally charged with a crime. And centuries ago in England, it was supposed to be a citizen's safeguard against the monarchy, a layer to ensure that the prosecutor was not just willy-nilly charging a person for no good reason. The guys who wrote our U.S. Constitution kind of had a thing about abuses by the monarchy. They wrote this grand jury piece into the Fifth Amendment. As a consequence, to this day, if you're going to get charged with a federal felony, a grand jury first has to decide there is some cause for the government to bring those charges against you. It doesn't mean you're guilty. It just means there's at least something there to support the charges, right? And make you go through arrest and a trial. Oh, and point of trivia interest, Wikipedia says that the grand jury system is only still used today in 2 countries of the entire world.
Oh.
We're one of them. Guess what the other one is?
England?
Liberia.
Oh, wow.
Was that on the tip of your tongue?
Wow.
I know it was.
Not at all.
Okay, so the Fifth Amendment applies to federal crimes. For crimes under state law, like, for example, murder in Wisconsin, what happens depends on the state's own laws and constitutions. Some states, like New York, even today, use grand juries like the federal system, and they take place in secret. Other states use something called a preliminary hearing, which takes place in public in front of a judge. But the concept is still exactly the same. It's the mechanism for assuring that there's at least some good cause for bringing charges. So just keep all of that in mind while we talk about a completely different animal called the inquest. Here, the inquest of the dead. The point of which is to determine how somebody died. Now, of course, things have changed over time, and today it's usually called a medical death investigation. But in 1891, Wisconsin, it was called Inquest of the Dead. Here's an excerpt from the Wisconsin statute that was in effect at the time of Bertha's death. Whenever the district attorney, Frawley, shall have notice of the death of any person, and from the circumstances surrounding the same, there is good reason to believe that murder, manslaughter, negligent homicide, excusable or justifiable homicide has been committed, and the venue of such offense is in his county, he, the district attorney, shall order and require the coroner, deputy coroner, or some justice of the peace to take an inquest as to how such person came to his death. Again, that was the old statute that was in effect in 1891. And so that's exactly what happened. District Attorney William Frawley ordered a justice of the peace named Nelson Chapman Wilcox to conduct an inquest as to how Bertha died. Mr. Wilcox was another Yankee from New York who was the proprietor of a general store in Eau Claire. He had no legal training and certainly no medical training. In addition, Mr. Wilcox was a United States revenue gauger.
What is that?
Thank you for asking, Kath.
I love that name.
This means almost nothing for the story, but it might come in handy on trivia night. Here's a snip from the United States Internal Revenue Gaugers Manual of 1900. Under the Internal Revenue System of the United States, distilled spirits are made largely the source of income to the government, secured by laying a tax upon each proof gallon. United States Internal Revenue Gaugers are appointed to correctly determine the number of such gallons of spirits produced and drawn into casks or packages to be put upon the market and to make record of the same. So basically, N.C. Wilcox was a booze inspector for the IRS.
Interesting.
Sounds like a cushy job.
Yeah.
And of course, he was also Justice of the Peace in Eau Claire. All right, so Mr. Wilcox seems to have been highly respected in the Eau Claire community. And as it turns out, his son Roy, who later became a very prominent attorney, was the clerk. And in this context, it's what we would have called the stenographer, who took down the transcripts from the inquest, and I think also from Elizabeth's eventual trial. Anyway, Justice of the Peace Nelson Chapman Wilcox convened something called a coroner's jury for the inquest. And I found the actual inquest report in the archives at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and here's what it says. In Justice Court, City and County of Eau Claire, before N.C. Wilcox, Justice of the Peace, inquest of the dead body of Bertha Erickson, a female, May 14th, 1891. On receiving notice from W.H. Frawley, District Attorney of Eau Claire County, Wisconsin, that a female body of a human being was lying dead at the graveyard at Hadleyville, town of Pleasant Valley, Eau Claire County, Wisconsin, and that a medical inquiry should be made as to when, where, and by what means the said Bertha Erickson, deceased, came to her death. Precept was issued. Precept is like a warrant or a summons to appear, and placed in the hands of Jewel Hark, under sheriff of said Eau Claire County, Wisconsin, commanding him to immediately summon 6 true and lawful citizens to serve as a jury in an inquest to be held at the wagon shed near the graveyard at Hadleyville.
At a bar.
To inquire upon the view of the body of said Bertha Erickson, when, how, and by what means she came to her death. Okay, so let's review. On command of the 29-year-old district attorney, who's already lining his own pockets, the IRS booze inspector summons 6 random men to a barn to look at the dug-up body of Bertha Erickson and decide how she died.
This is a month and a half after she was buried.
Yeah.
Wow. Was the doctor one of those 6 people? Or is he like an extra?
He's an extra.
Okay, so he's there though in the barn.
Right. So they were also there to hear testimony from witnesses. So, hopefully it was a big barn.
Oh, and the body's just out?
But the main event was examination of the body by the doctor, the justice of the peace, the district attorney, and these 6 random men who served as the jury.
Okay.
Remember, Dr. Chase was having none of this because nobody had given him any good reason to suspect Elizabeth Russell of murder. So the doctor on the scene was District Attorney Frawley's friend, Dr. Lyman.
Right.
Now here's a description of Dr. Lyman's testimony describing the day of the inquest. And this might answer some of your questions. The coffin, which, yes, had been dug up again, was in charge of, drumroll, John Jensen, Ed, and Adam Erickson. The same guys. So apparently they dug it up again. And they had custody of Bertha's remains prior to the inquest. So they could have done anything to the body, but nobody chose to point this out.
Right.
On opening the coffin, Dr. Lyman found the corpse was lying on the back, the face covered with mildew. There was no appearance of the body being violently used in any manner after death.
Ugh.
The body was removed from the casket, laid upon a board table. The external appearance was noted. No discoloration of the face was apparent, even though he just said it was covered in mildew.
Other than that.
On the neck, there was a small place showing decomposition. The clothing was removed and body examined. There was the characteristic settling of blood in dead bodies. The arms and joints were placid and the body in good state of preservation. The internal organs were examined. So not only are all these farmer men looking at naked Bertha lying on a board in a barn, they're also watching this local country doctor chop her up.
Oh, gross.
The internal organs were examined carefully and found in good condition. Now, how would these guys know whether the human organ was or was not in good condition?
And dead organs, so they can't be
They can't be that good.
Absolutely.
The stomach was removed and placed in a jar.
Oh.
The intestines and other parts had been examined and were described. The brain showed the most evidence of decomposition.
I wonder what they're looking for if they think poison. Like, what are they looking for?
Well, good questions. And here we go. There was another doctor there too, named Dr. Jewel. So this is doctor number 4, but Dr. Lyman still seemed to be the leader. Both Dr. Lyman and Dr. Jewel said in the inquest report that Bertha's left kidney was diseased. Now remember, that's what Dr. Chase had been saying all during Bertha's sickness. And the medicines Dr. Chase prescribed, based on what we know today, very likely made her condition worse rather than better.
Yeah, right.
At the trial, though, Dr. Lyman proclaimed there was no evidence of any disease.
Oh, boy.
Elizabeth's lawyer tried to call him out on the discrepancies between his inquest report and his trial testimony, but again, nobody seemed to notice. So the theory driving this whole inquest thing was that Elizabeth had poisoned Bertha. Now, as we just heard, they removed Bertha's stomach and placed it in a jar. They also removed parts of her other organs, though it's not exactly clear which ones. The inquest was then adjourned. So, according to the inquest report, the doctors have time to make a chemical and microscopic examination of the remains.
Mhm.
Now, that sounds way more scientific than what actually happened.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
The jars containing Bertha's organs were transported where? To Dr. Lyman's office
Oh boy.
by two guys named Harkey and Bostwick.
How much did they get? $25.
And so far as I can tell, the only examination that actually happened as part of the inquest was this. Someone named E.R. Godding, who worked for Frawley, brought a jar of stomach fluid to the local druggist, whose name was Otto Boberg. Mr. Boberg ran a test for arsenic and, shocker, found traces.
Okay.
Ooh, all right.
And that's it. The stomach was in Dr. Lyman's sole custody for who knows how long. Then Frawley's guys basically brought a random bottle of fluid to Walgreens, saying it was Bertha's stomach, and voila, arsenic.
Wow. So no one was following this sample around.
Oh man.
Oh,
Oh, wow.
the only people who had access to this sample was Frawley and his buddies.
Wow. That is bad.
The inquest reconvened on May 26, and there was testimony from a long list of people, including Elizabeth Russell herself. It didn't much matter, though, because Frawley got what he wanted. That same night, May 26, 1891, at 11:50 p.m., the coroner's jury reached its verdict. After hearing the evidence and viewing the remains, the jury rendered the following verdict: that Bertha Erickson came to her death April 1st, 1891, by the administration of arsenic poison by the hand of Elizabeth Russell. The above verdict was signed by each juror and filed by the court. N.C. Wilcox, Justice of the Peace. Boom.
Wild. How long did that jury deliberate? Do we know?
The inquest reconvened on May 26th, and the verdict was later that night.
Wow.
I'm thinking too, it just seems like a jump to a conclusion that the only reason she has arsenic in her bloodstream or in any of her organs was because Elizabeth put it there.
Well, have we heard any evidence?
Like, why is Elizabeth the one to be
I
pinned?
know,
Yeah.
exactly.
So weird.
Right.
Elizabeth put it there.
All right.
Who was that guy that peered in the window?
P.P. Elmer.
Elmer.
Well, at this point, it would be helpful to have an expert on how criminal procedure worked in Eau Claire County in 1891, and I'm still looking for somebody. But in the meantime, remember what we were just saying about grand juries and there needing to be some kind of a basis before a person gets charged with a crime. There's a very murky relationship between the grand jury process, which accuses a person, and the inquest process, which is just supposed to be an investigation. In modern times, the person known for challenging this murky relationship is Senator Ted Kennedy.
Oh, interesting.
Funny.
On July 18th, 1969, Mary Jo Kopechne died after the car in which she was riding, which was operated by Senator Kennedy, went off a bridge on Chappaquiddick Island in Dukes County, Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
A medical examiner determined that the cause of death was drowning, and Senator Kennedy pled guilty to a charge of leaving the scene of an accident after causing personal injury. Now, the incident received tremendous coverage in the press, much of it generated by Senator Kennedy himself, because he went on television and literally asked the people of Massachusetts to weigh in on whether he should resign his seat in the U.S. Senate. That caused the local district attorney there to think, maybe Kennedy should not only resign, maybe I could send him to jail.
Oh, yeah.
So the district attorney exercised his discretion under the Massachusetts statutes and ordered an inquest.
Oh, interesting.
Now, Senator Kennedy, describing himself as the operator of the motor vehicle and a prospective witness, filed a motion requesting that he be permitted to have the right to be represented by counsel and to have counsel present during the entire inquest proceeding. Because basically what he's saying was, this proceeding could end up accusing me of a crime, so I should be entitled to all the rights and protections available under the Constitution. Now, this was especially so in Senator Kennedy's view for two reasons. reasons. One, because he was the only eyewitness to the event, and he was the obvious focus of the investigation. And two, the intensive media coverage could lead to damaging pretrial publicity. His theory was that this inquest was likely to be accusatory rather than a mere investigation. So he made this motion for counsel, and the judge found against him and disagreed. The judge said, "I'm not satisfied that the United States Supreme Court would read the due process clause into our inquest procedure." He said that Senator Kennedy's counsel could be present when Kennedy himself was in the courtroom just to advise him on constitutional rights against self-incrimination, but that was it. Kennedy's counsel would not be permitted to do anything else or participate in any other aspect of the inquest. Kennedy then appealed that ruling to a higher Massachusetts court, and that court said, nope. That court said an inquest is not a prosecution of anybody. It's not a trial of anyone. The statutes exemplify a public policy that the inquest serves as an aid in the achievement of justice by obtaining information as to whether a crime has been committed. The court also said, basically, you're not that special, Ted Kennedy. We shall not make any special rule for a particular case. If it is desirable to prescribe procedural rules for any Massachusetts inquest, those rules must affect all inquests and all participating persons equally. Okay, so I won't go any further with this legal debate over constitutional rights in connection with inquests or the relationship between investigatory inquests versus accusatory grand jury proceedings. Suffice to say, there's plenty to debate, and frankly, I can see Ted Kennedy's point. For our purposes, though, the point of all of this was just to set the stage for what eventually happened to Elizabeth Russell. A coroner's jury of 6 random men, 1 ambitious district attorney, and 2 doctors/friends of the district attorney, conducted an inquest, which was supposed to be just an investigation, resulting in a verdict, which they called a verdict, that Bertha Jensen Erickson met her death by arsenic poisoning, which would have been fine to stop right there.
Right.
And that the arsenic had been administered to Bertha by the hand of Elizabeth Russell.
Yeah, that's weird.
There are no facts about that.
That's a big leap.
Wow.
It's a witch hunt.
So now the district attorney is the only one that is a legal voice in this so far. I mean, aren't there other attorneys that can say there's no reason why there should have been an accusatory part of this?
No, not yet. I mean, even in the days of Ted Kennedy, that wasn't allowed.
Yeah.
So it sure as heck wasn't allowed in the days of Elizabeth Russell. This was 100% the William Frawley show.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, he just wanted to get notoriety.
Was there any relationship between him and Elizabeth Russell's husband? Like, is there any bad blood?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I'm not aware of any, but who knows? That could be an angle.
Yeah, like what's his motive?
Right. I mean, I'm just making this assumption that it's raw ambition, but there could be plenty of other reasons.
Has he come back at all, by the way? Has he ever come home?
Oh, yeah.
He does. He does come home.
Maybe he was the one doling out the arsenic.
There's a lot to consider.
Yeah.
In our next episode, we'll see how the public responded to this bombshell. We'll also learn that Elizabeth Russell would shortly become the victim of an act of misconduct so outlandish, you would roll your eyes if you read it in a novel. But it happened in real life.
Wow.
So we'll leave it at that.
Leaving us hanging.
Yep, cliffhanger.
Doppelnamers is a production of Harriet's Guides, LLC. Our theme music was composed and performed by Mary Jean Stead, orchestrated and arranged by Janine Lynn Claps. The Doppelnamers logo was designed by Kay Lum. Thanks to my co-hosts, Mary Jean Stead and Kathy Boyle Almeida. Thanks to the Wisconsin State Law Library, the Wisconsin Historical Society, the archivists at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse. Take care, Doppelnamers.